Okay, well, as the title says, what does the title say? Right. Talking Agile led to a NDA covered conversation on who should we fire at a company. So that's what this is about. Very weird conversation. Oh, first, I should say it's 6 a.m., 6:30 a.m. I haven't slept. Insomnia kicked in really bad. So, and yeah, so I kept thinking about this. I kept thinking about a lot of things, but I kept thinking about this conversations, I should say, right? Only the last conversation was kind of the good one. So, I've been a software developer a long time, and I've worked at more than a few companies. But one of the interesting things about being a software developer is that you can take odd jobs sometimes, right? And for some reason, back in the day, it was much easier. I should say, back in the day, the jobs found me. Well, gee, so yeah, back then the jobs found me. Like the first. This is what I mean. The first job that I got was to a software developer. Let me see. Oh, this was like 20 something years ago. So this company had a rewards program with major airlines, right? So every time somebody would fly on a major airlines, they'd get airline points. And then they could use these points to use this company's service, right? Instead of putting them towards their flight. And I mean, it was a good deal, I guess. I don't know. I didn't fly at the time. But the software developer that wrote the program locked the company out of the server, disabled the application, right? So it would go out, it would grab a file from the airlines. It would then parse that file, and then when people tried to use the credit, it would say, okay, this person has this much credit, and do the whole thing. And it was all terribly sloppy. No, not really real time, more like batch time, right? Because it would pull it at a weird hour, and then it would batch all of the customers' requests and send those like every 4 hours, right? So in order to, I don't know, but terribly stupid program. The guy locked the guy that wrote the software locked the company out. So this is not the kind of job that you want, right? Because now a company's hiring you to go break into another software developer's code. You don't know what kind of contract they have with them, and you don't even know if the software developer can come in and get you. But at the time, um, at the time, uh, it was a friend of a friend who was making the request, so I did it, and it took me the better part of a day to clean it all out and fix it all up. It was written in this kind of I don't even remember what it was written in, but it was like the security of the software application was a joke. There was no security. Once I had admin on the box, I could do anything I wanted, and that's exactly what I did. So I locked the guy out. Um, Locked the guy out and made the program run, basically, right? And I did hear about the consequences of that. That software developer freaked out and went to the offices and was ranting and raving, saying, claiming he was going to sue and find and he didn't know I did it. He didn't know how it was done. He didn't know anything like that. But he was pissed at the company. He said that they breached a contract with him. But this was a fairly, maybe, I don't know, mid-sized company with fairly sharp people working there. So I don't think I was going to get any blowback from that. But that was shady. And then I did something even shadier, which I'm not going to talk about. And then I did something even shadier for the same guys. But then, well, let me see. So I told you one thing, the two shadies. But then 1 week I had access to a room with hardware and different computers, and I reverse engineered an API. And that was really good money. I have no idea who the actual client was. The company that hired me, I don't even think they really existed. They were out of Ohio. That was all I could find, was they were a registered company in Ohio. Which, who knows, that might be too much information. But that led to a pretty legitimate job where I met the fellow that I was talking to Agile about. Actually, I've been talking to him about Agile probably since 2006, 2007, right? I knew him before that. And he hired me. They had hired a company that had written a very large Java platform, and it did not work at all. And it worked in a way that was hard to diagnose. Basically, they had this running problem. This software was supposed to go live in like 2 months when they called me. So they had this software that was supposed to go live. The company had gotten them to sign off on the software and wanted more money to figure out what the problem was. So this guy called me because he was fairly sure that the software developers were yanking his chain, that they knew what the problem was. They were just trying to get a lot more money out of him. And I didn't know, right? So I showed up. The guy gives me a laptop, gives me complete access to his network. At that point, I just dove into everything, right? I had a whiteboard, and I was drawing servers and lines. And then at one point, I'm looking at the different layers of communications in the system. I don't want to say it was a huge company. It was a phenomenally huge company that had bought a company that I had worked for before. But it was a huge company, and they actually hired me as an employee for 30 days to do this job, right? And if I didn't come up with anything, it didn't matter. I was still getting paid for 30 days. If I fixed it within an hour, I was still getting paid for 30 days. It was a great contract, right? But I didn't get it fixed in 30 days, and then things happened. But so I'm going through it layer by layer, and then all of a sudden I see a problem, and I'm not too sure about it. And I wouldn't have seen it if I wasn't going through it line by line in the code, just walking through the code, trying to figure out where the code was calling. And these were multiple networked systems. So I found the problem. It was way too chatty for what it needed to do. right? So that was the thing. It was way too chatty. It was getting the same information. Like when the customer wanted to see it, it was getting that same information like 82 times every time. And it was all different things, right? So it just was terribly inefficient with data. It was just terribly written. It was thrown together on this Java platform that I personally hated. And my first suggestion before even signing anything on that job was just ditch that technology and start over again. But I found it in about a week, drew it all out, had this guy who was in charge of their IT standing next to me, going through this, questioning everything, looking at code with me for like 3 days. Finally, the guy totally agreed with me. And he called he called the big boss. The big boss was in New York City. And I'm on the conference line, and the big boss in New York City over the conference phone says something along the lines of, "You better be right. I'm changing all of my plans for the next month, or for like the next 30 days or the next couple weeks or whatever, and I'm bringing those explorative goddamn fucking whatever he said, those developers with me," right? So he was literally like getting them, putting them on a plane and flying with them to where I live to go to this company to listen to what I felt the problem was. So contractually, these guys got really pissed and they're like, well, he's not allowed to work on it. And contractually, the big boss in New York was screaming at him, "You didn't give us working software. You guys aren't leaving this town until it's fixed," right? And I was just like, so I had to sit there for the rest of the 30 days and make sure that they just kind of got their shit done, right? And just looked over the code. And they really didn't like me. They really didn't want me looking at their stuff, but and at the end of the day, they really had no choice. So that's how I met this guy, right? And he was a pretty good coder, but he wanted to go into management at that point. I guess I was probably, fuck if I know, 30 maybe. I have no idea. He was a couple years older than me. We had a outside interest to software development, which kind of kept us in contact for a couple years after that job. And then things changed, families, right? Stuff like that comes up. But every once in a while, it's good to have the same email address for 30 years and the same phone number for, well, 25 years, 27 years, right? Because when those people call you out of the blue, sometimes it's nice to talk to them. And this is one of those guys. He's a crypto guy too, so that was another reason why he's talked to me every once in a while. Anyway, so that's why he called me, because he's been talking to me since, well, I was telling him about Agile, firm believer in Agile, right? And he was kind of going from company to company, and this is really a point in time where nobody's interested in Agile, to be honest with you. 2006, 2008, 2010, software developers, unless you get hired somewhere that's already doing Agile, software developers didn't want to do Agile. It was my impression at the time. It was quite frustrating because a lot of people that were hired to do Agile didn't want to do what Agile was back then. And so they changed it. So 2015, 2016 rolls around, and this guy's company is that he's been working at for a while, and he's worked his way up in the ranks. is switching to Agile. So he's all excited. He's like, "Oh yeah, I've heard about this kind of stuff. It's good stuff, and you know, it'd be nice to be able to do some of the things." And he was never really an open source guy, but I mean, he knew I was. Um, but he was pretty excited and he was pretty happy, and I think they did what most companies do is they hired a let's call him an agile coach, right? And the agile coach started with one team, and he injected things, processes, agile processes into the team, and changed the structure of the teams because it wasn't, well, I guess it was waterfall, right? But waterfall depends on how far the water has to fall sometimes as to how. I digress. So we've talked about Agile, and he's not talked to me about Agile very much in the last few years. He's doing his own thing. They're doing their own thing over there. So he asked me before the new year, right? He said, well, in a nutshell, he said that this is the most unhappy that he's been in software development in his whole career. And there's a lot of things that has happened in the last couple of years. So we've talked in depth about telecommuting or telepresence and stuff like that. And I got to admit, you know, 1 week into the lockdowns, right? The company that I'm working for locks down 1 week into the lockdown. And I'm like, when are we coming back to work? I didn't like that at all, and because it was a nightmare for me. I've had, you see, it all really depends on the caliber of both programmers that are. If you're gonna telecommute, well, okay, let's back up. If you go to the extreme of pair programming and telecommuting, both developers need to be really good at pair programming and test-driven development, and you know, because I've worked with, I sometimes, like, the best developers that I've worked with were great when they were junior developers. So it doesn't sound right to say junior developer or mid-level developer, but you know, if the woman is 24, 25 years old, 26 years old, and she's fucking awesome at software development, and that was my last pairing experience where it was awesome, right? The tests are being written, the code's being written, the discussions are happening, the questions are being asked, the refactoring's happening. So it can be done. It can be done. The problem is, man, you really gotta be on the ball. You can't be, and that was the thing. So we were talking about telecommuting and Agile, and how Agile seemed to be working just fine. They weren't really seeing like the boost in quality or the boost in performance, but it was working well, and the communication of what work needed to be done was working out for them, maybe a little better than waterfall. But then the whole telecommuting thing happened, right? And they lost a couple developers when the telecommuting happened to big companies that were hiring people that were working from home, right? So these guys. So he lost his best talent because oh, I've said this a long time. Talent is not afraid to walk out the door, right? That's not a developer's perspective. That is a perspective that I have told management multiple times over the years when they've been shafting one of their fucking employees, right? Is that, talent's not afraid to walk out the door. And you don't know what's going to come in after them, right? And that's what happened was they hired there's like a trend, right? There, and I call them, well, they basically they come from code camps, right? So code campers, is that about right? Basically not people that spent their life honing software development or went to a formal school or had a formal education in software development. I mean, I was writing code before I went to the war, right? But when I came back from the war, that was what I chose to do, was to write code, but I still went to school for it, right? I still went to college for it. I still have the college credits for all the comp sci classes and infosys and including a shit ton in natural sciences, but you get the idea. So they hired people that weren't that good, and he thought that Agile was going to help them become better software developers, right? Which didn't happen. And it didn't happen because they're not in the office. They're not talking. They're at home. I don't know if they're using Zoom or what, but, there was no communication. There was no, and I had him. I had a discussion with him about, a competent manager, a competent senior developer, or whoever's in charge of the fucking circus, right? Should know how to look through fucking Git and should know how to look at commits and figure out how those commits happened, right? And boy, oh boy, I reminded him of that a while back, and he ran with it and was really, really upset with all of his new hires. Everyone that he's hired last 3 years, apparently. I don't know what to tell you. So they started off with an Agile coach. Because I asked him, how were they doing it before? That's what I should start with, right? How were they doing it before? So my understanding is they have like 3 layers of software development. They have a kind of a production team that kind of maintains and updates some pretty heavy legacy code. They have some internal stuff for some of their internal employees, and a third thing. All right, what am I missing here? All their customer service, all their human resources, all of that stuff is farmed out. They don't do any of that. Right? So, they got a whole team that just does reports or maintains reports. And I think what that technology is if you're a software developer, but I'm not going to mention it. I'm not going to mention that company. It's a huge company. They do big data or some shit like that. Not very well, which is why I'm not going to mention it. But so that's what they've got. But they've got them spread out. So they're not really big teams in the beginning, right? So they would have, so they had like 2 developers in one location, 4 developers in another, 8 in another, and like another 4 or 5 at another location, right? So they're spread out. They're doing their own thing. There's no commingling between them, right? Which is fine. Which is fine. But what happened was that they lost key players on some of the important teams, right? And those were the guys that left. But they switched to Agile, and all of a sudden their Agile coach turned into 2 Scrum Masters, 5 QA, 5 POs, and 3 project delivery. I don't know. They couldn't explain exactly what the guy did because it kept sounding like what a software developer should be doing anyway. And that's what my end thing was that it sounded to me like, okay. So we had these small teams, mainly software developers, mainly being told by him and 2 other guys what needed to be done, what needed to be worked on, what needed to be fixed, what the priorities were, right? So they were pure project managers, right? And there was no QA at all. And that was a problem for them, right? That was a big problem for them. However, the solution for QA, apparently this is like rampant in IT, right? The solution for QA was to grab some users, give them a pay increase, and turn them into QA. Send them to classes. I don't know what kind of class teaches you to be QA. And we'll go into that later. They went to what I guess was their power users or their managers of the users, and they turned them into POs. Right? And then they hired in project managers. Right. So they created tiers. Oh, and then this release guy, right? Release coordinators, scrum masters. I thought the scrum masters did releases. I thought they coordinated releases. I don't even know what's going on anymore. They don't have a public interface. They don't have a mobile presence. This is all in-house stuff, right? Old school build a widget type crap. Let me see. Where am I? So their teams were small. They were only developers. The developers did all of their testing, but they weren't doing any type of they had a development environment that they were testing their code on. That's what they were doing. They weren't writing unit tests. They weren't writing UATs. They weren't doing anything like that. They weren't writing canaries for their services. So you have these big holes in quality, right? So the developers are not writing unit tests. That's another story. That's a whole nother story that just sounds like the last 10 years of my life. Well, excluding the last 2 years. 2 years have been good, I guess. I don't know. Where am I? It's really late. I've been up really long. So the developers are not really writing unit tests, although they're supposed to be writing tests. They don't have any canaries, so when things break down, they find out from the user. Uh, there is no trouble ticket system, which I didn't think was really a problem. Um, yeah, I don't know where they got the Scrum Masters from. I think they hired them. I think they hired them. I think the Agile guy came in and hired all of his friends, right? That's what they do. So now I understand kind of where they were for a decade, right? Before Agile came along in 2006, before they hired this guy in 2006. And I don't know what his qualifications are, but it sounded to me like he was doing what I've heard before, what I've seen before is he was sending people to. So let's backtrack. Maybe 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I taught a couple Agile classes and did a Agile transformation at a fairly large company. I wasn't in charge of the Agile transformation, but I was part of the team. There were three of us, so I have to get a little credit, right? 10% maybe. Anyway, so I've seen this happen. I've done this. And this was a successful Agile transformation. This was quite a long time ago, though. Um, before Agile went off its rocker, to be honest with you. So I always thought that the addition of QA, the addition of these POs and Agile coaches and Scrum Masters was a contracting trick, right? Because, I mean, to me, Agile, and I had arguments with people. Well, I shouldn't say arguments, but I had discussions that they weren't listening to me at all about how Agile needs to be taught to the developer. And most of the things that I'm seeing now that people are that they're hiring are things that the developers should be doing. I mean, if you really, I can't imagine, like I can I've seen it. I've seen it for the last 12 years. Project product owners that have no IT experience. They have no experience sitting down and writing code. If my heavy opinion on this is that you might you should not. And I actually said this to the guy. I said, um, if your product owner doesn't have 5+ years of experience writing software, you don't have a product owner. You don't have someone that understands what goes into the development of software. And that's where I think part of the communication broke down. So you have that, right? So now who's testing the software? Right. Well, when I started off, before Agile was Agile, before it had a name, we were writing tests for our code. So maybe we wrote our code first, but we were writing tests for our code. Um, and this goes all the way back to the Microsoft book Code Complete, right, which was the first book on testing that I read, right, because I wanted to be able to test my code. I wanted to be, I didn't want to be called in the middle of the night, basically saying my code didn't work. So where was I? So he had a pretty good thing going on for a while, it sounded like. For a little while, people were liking the tools, people were liking how things were working. Um, but things were getting slowed down. So he's now my friend, let's call him my friend. He's now working with two other guys that are managing all of the business requirements. So to me, that's a project manager, right? Or a director. And you can have multiple directors. I don't know how company structures work, but you could have multiple directors. You could have a director of this and a director of that. Trust me, they can hand out these fucking titles like goddamn Pez when they want to. Where was I? Handing out Pez. But all of a sudden, the software that he's getting is not quite what he was expecting. It's not quite the quality that he was expecting. And this is an old C guy who used to do GUIs, right? So, he can be rough. But he's just noticing that things aren't quite working the way that they're planned, right? So, he's trying to watch things closely. He's got his own job to do, but he's noticing that his QA is not catching things, right? Because he's like a metrics guy. He can collect metrics. So he's noticing that his QA, doesn't seem to be catching things, and that their quality is not going up with there. And he doesn't understand it because, the QA is in all of the meetings that he's in with all the POs. They're having their meetings. He's having meetings where developers are showing up, so stuff like that's happening. And his QA can't do anything from my understanding, because I've asked him. I said, well, can they? I reminded him of a company that I worked at before, where first I had to prove to my manager that the software worked. Then I had to hand it over to a QA department. And I didn't know who was going to test it. But that QA department back in the day used to be able to do some very goddamn important things. The first thing they used to be able to do is they used to be able to write code, right? They used to be able to write scripts. They used to be able to run the application as a user and simulate the production environment. They used to be able to maintain their own QA environments, right? I feel like I'm missing something. They used to be able to run their own code, maintain their own environments. Right. This is what this department did. So, and then they would call this QA department would call me up or send me an email. I think they usually send me an email. Sometimes they'd call me if they had questions, like their QA environment wasn't working the way they were expecting it to, or something like that. They'd call me over and make sure it wasn't my program doing it. But most of the time they'd set up a thing, and they'd send you an email either saying it passed, which even then, you got to be that was always iffy. But sometimes they'd give you an email and they'd say, hey, meet me at this time. You'd show up. The person in charge of QA would be there, and the guy that did the QA would be there, and they would both tell me how my application failed and give me a fair amount of detail. I remember one time I turned in, and I was shocked. I turned in an application that was Pro C, It was Oracle SQL, and the QA I thought, oh, this is fucking perfect. A lot of times when you're a developer, you think, oh man, my code is fucking perfect this time. This time I wrote it perfect the first time. This was a long time before I had my throw it away rule. But QA came back and they're like, we need you to change your SQL because it doesn't perform as well as it should. And I thought, whoa, hold on. I'm like a SQL pro. And that QA guy sat me down with Explain Plan and explained exactly why I needed to rewrite my SQL and change a few things. And that was QA back in the day. That was QA, what year is it? That was QA 20 years ago. That's what QA was like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Yep. That's not what his QA was. His QA was running scripts, test scripts, and running the application. But they were running the scripts, the testing scripts that the developers were writing. Not scripts, the instructions on how to test the application. Like, this is what we changed, enter this, and then you should see it over here, right? And when I had that discussion with him, I was like, why do you even have QA? What's the point at that point? If they can't maintain their own environment, if they can't write their own testing scripts, things that they need to test, and then maintain, why do you need QA? And I've worked on teams where QA was so busy testing that it was just in the interest of the team for the developers to take over things like making sure that canaries were correct and written correct and stuff like that, right? And there ended up being a whole QA process for certain levels of testing, right? But that's not what this was. That's not what he had going on. And then none of his POs understood IT. So I think what was going on was he had all these developers that were now telecommuting. They want them all to come back to the office. A bunch of them don't want to come back to the office, not even for like 2 days out of the week or 3 days out of the week, right? They just don't want to do it. And they're the first on the chopping block, I think, right? But I told him, you got to keep your developers. You don't know what you're going to be. You don't know what knowledge you're cutting off. In other words, so don't have any idea what he'll actually do. But yeah, so we had those kind of conversations. Where he's kind of wondering, what should he do? And then he's bringing ideas to the guy who's in charge of the Agile efforts, the coach, right? And the coach is, I don't know. I don't know how that interaction really goes, but it doesn't sound like much is improving. They don't do retrospectives. Which is a huge sign of team dysfunction if a team doesn't even want to do a retrospective, in my mind. That's just personal opinion. But yeah. And then, so I've had those discussions with that guy over the last couple years. Mostly, I guess he wants to talk to me about Bitcoin, but he hasn't talked to me much about Bitcoin either because the market's down. So, he's really good friends with the CFO, and the other two guys that are working for him are having their own problems with getting stuff done, You know, I keep telling him, oh, yeah, a good story shouldn't take much longer than a day. Right. And he's like, oh, we see these stories and they're on the board for 2 weeks. And it's like, gosh, I've seen that too. And that's just people fucking around, man. That's just people not getting shit done, not getting help. That goes to, if you don't have the communication between the developers where where a developer can say, hey, I can't get this done and not feel stupid, and he doesn't have any developers around him that say, okay, hey, I'm going to drop what I'm doing right now and work on your problem and work through your problem, right, with you. You're screwed. A story just stays on the board. It just stays up there. So that's what he has seen constantly since the whole telecommuting thing. And that's why management is pissed. That's why they don't want it, because the truth is that, the productivity hasn't gone down. You have some shining stars, but these are these are the guys with hero complex, right? So, um, so the CFO talked to me, and before he talked to me, he asked me if I would sign a non-disclosure. And it looks like they are preparing to get rid of a lot of their staff. Now, the three guys that have been there the longest, that are running the show, so to speak, they're done with the management layer, right? Because now 40% of their IT department is management of some kind, right? And I'm throwing QA in with that group, but that's what it is 40% of their IT department is checkbox people, right? Because all his PO does is talk to him, turn around, write a bunch of stories that the software developers don't understand. There's no grooming involved whatsoever. They write their stories and it's just boom, story done, story done, story done, story done. Nobody understands them. And he ends up having to go and talk to the developers to explain what those stories are supposed to be doing, which is an odd position for him to be in, right? That's not what he should be doing. But at this point, he's ready to cut out that whole middle, right? And maybe it seems to me that a lot of this stuff, adding scrum masters, adding product owners and project managers, and did I say scrum? Did I count scrum yet? And scrum masters onto that. Maybe that only works when you're, working on project contract work, right? When you can bill your customer for the extra labor, right? And your customer won't think twice about it. But for the in-house development, I'm not sure if it's the way to go. And telecommuting has been really bad, right? So it hasn't worked out. There's not enough shining stars, basically. Because I mean, if I'm on a team, let's say you have a 50-50, right? Let's just say you have a 50-50. 50% of your telecommuting team is really not checked in. They're really not helping anybody else. They're really not learning anything, and they're really not pushing stories through the board, right? Well, your other developers, your other 50%, they're going to see that and they're going to get pissed. And they're going to wonder, why the fuck is this person able to lie to the PO and leave stories and and make up excuses on why a story hasn't been done for a week. Um, and they're just going to get tired of it. They're going to quit. They're going to check out. They're going to do all kinds of things, right? So it's bad, right? I mean, the PO is more than just a story cat herder, so to speak. But they're in kind of trouble. So that's what he was wondering. Um, was how much of this is really going to have an impact, right? And they have to look at how they operated before. They have to look at how they operated now, and they need to take some of the best of both worlds. And my friend was saying that he's ready to write code if that's what it takes, because um, things are getting real out there, and he's very tired of not getting results, I should say. And the reason is because he's not his POs, they to me they sound like they talk to him, they create a bunch of check boxes. They talk to the developers and then they uncheck those check boxes. And as long as they can kind of have this paperwork that proves that boxes are being checked, they're skating, right? And it's kind of similar with QA. I've worked with fantastic QA over the years, and I've worked with just, why did you hire this person, right? I worked with one QA, and I thought he knew what he was doing, and I found out that he had never worked QA before. He had never been in an IT department before. He wasn't even really a big computer user. Like, the only computer that he had ever used was a Mac, and the software we were doing was not Mac. Let me just put it that way. And holy cow, it's like, how'd you get in the door, right? How'd you get in the door? And he checked boxes, right? But the PO at the time was asking him to do things like run reports to get numbers for him. And the guy was like running reports that didn't make any sense, right? Because he didn't know how to run reports. He didn't know how to do anything. He would sit in front of the thing and click on the software over and over again for about 3 hours a day and fuck around the other 5. And now if you're just in your house, Jesus, I mean, yeah. But things are going to change hard. Telecommuting should work, right? It should work. It should be something that does work, but sometimes it doesn't. I think that's really kind of their biggest problem, is that their whole process, their whole control over their IT department fell apart with telecommuting and trying to do Agile at the same time, right? Because if it was just telecommuting back in the day, it probably would have worked a lot better. But right now, it's I don't know. I think they're using Slack. I don't know what they're using for video conferencing. They're definitely not pairing. He's telling me they're not writing tests. So yeah, things are going through QA by hand and QA can't maintain their environments. The QA environment is a shambles as far as data goes and stuff like that. So, yep. But that's what they're looking to do. That is they're looking to get rid of some of these layers over the development onion, and they're starting to see the idea after I talked to them that, if the developers are doing all of this work, why are these other people around? Why? Because you can shift this work. I explained to him that when you have a software development team, and it doesn't matter really it's any software development team. If you've got 4 guys that write software, right, and they actually write software, at least one of them is literate enough in a meeting and dresses nice and will dress nice enough for a meeting to show up to that meeting. And that's the guy that you want to unload a lot of the PO responsibilities on, right? And then everything else is everybody else, right? You have big teams, you have multiple developers that do the PO role. So, and then releasing, that should be release early, release often, right? That's supposed to be agile, but why do you have somebody that is staggering releases, right? Planning release dates and doing shit like that and saying these features need to be in this release. If you're agile, if you can, just throwing that out there. I'm going to get a lot of hate from this. I'm going to get hate from Scrum Masters. I'm going to get hate from POs, project managers, Agile coaches, QA, and whatever this delivery position is, right? This delivery coordinator. God damn, that's a new one. I'd never heard of that one before. They coordinate anything that gets, put into production. It's like, the fuck does a Scrum Master do? He organizes the projects, that are like, fuck all. But, yeah. So, his concern was that their IT department is able to function. And if you just took 20% of your management, 20% of your QA, and 20% of your developers and sliced it off, that would just be suicide. That would be suicide for a company. That's what I'm thinking. So that's what I told them. I don't know what they're going to do. They are gearing up right now. They have a list of people, is my impression, that they are ready to cut loose, and they were just wondering what my thoughts on it from an agile perspective was, because they want to get rid of the agile coach. Let me just put it that way right now. They want to they're not sure what the guy does other than hire friends and hang out with POs, right? So, all right, that's it. I'm going to leave it at that. It's 7 a.m. I guess I've been talking for almost an hour, so yeah, I feel tired. I feel like I've talked enough. Hopefully I haven't mentioned any names or anything like that. But yeah. All right. Have a good weekend. It's going to be hard. I have seen these waves of layoffs before, and they are not pretty at all. I saw them in 2000 with the dot-com bubble. I saw them, and that was a hard time. I was out of work for a little bit during that period myself when I lost my job. The company that I was working for was bought, and I was the only Java guy in the building. So they cut me right away. They're like, Java, we don't do Java. Get rid of that guy. Yeah, and then in 2008, I saw a lot of good developers. They got let go from their jobs, and it was hard for them to find anything. You end up one or two of those shadowy jobs was during that time where I just needed the money. I didn't care what the software did. I just needed the money. It wasn't scamming anybody. I wasn't like skimming credit cards or anything like that. It was above the board in the fact that there was a customer and there was a product, and wasn't drugs either. It wasn't anything physical, but It was fucking shady. Um, and you never know, right? I mean, the whole new economy's kicking in. There's all kinds of things that you can do. But it's going to be rough, man. This is going to be, this is, I'm expecting these layoffs to affect a lot more people than the past two that I've seen. I'm expecting it to be a lot worse. And I'm expecting it to hit IT a lot because we've seen this, right? And maybe this is Agile's fault now that I think about it, because it seems to me around 2014 or 2015, one of the Agile manifesto knuckleheads started talking about doing more to get diversity into IT, right? And then out of that, it got built into the ESG score. Look up ESG and see what that is, right? If you have a company, you can't get money without you can't get loans without an ESG. Apparently, that's my understanding of it. But this is what happened to Twitter, right? I mean, you look at Twitter, and I remember when Twitter first came out, and I was like, I remember the day Twitter came out, and it was like, what, 120, 140 characters you could put in it? And I was like, holy shit, this is so fucking stupid simple, right? And it should be stupid simple for the most part. You don't get any support with Twitter until the whole IT push, right? To now all of a sudden, if you've got, the right look, you are in IT and you're hanging out and getting free soda. Which I'm a firm believer in free soda, by the way. I think free soda is better than free coffee. There are people on this planet like myself who can't drink coffee. So having something to caffeinate yourself at work, if you're going to give free coffee, you should give free soda. Get a fountain machine at your work. I don't fucking care. I think cans are more reliable, or fountain machines. Don't get 2 liters. That's gay. Yeah. Yeah. So Twitter is suffering from that. If you haven't heard about the Twitter layoffs, I'm not here to give you any Twitter news, right? This is shit you should know. But that's what Twitter suffered from. They pumped up they're a tech company, so everyone that they hire is counts towards being in tech, whether or not they've ever done anything in tech or not before that job. They're in there, and I mean, so that was no surprise to me. I think Facebook is terrible. Oh my God, Facebook is terrible web performance for what you're getting, and they've even got limiting on there. I've been looking at boats on Facebook, and they keep saying you've looked at too many boats. It's like, no, I haven't. There's plenty of boats for sale in America, but they're like, no, you got to stop for a few hours. Yeah, so IT has really changed in the last decade. We had, and when it comes to Agile, Agile's big claim to fame is, oh, it's better than Waterfall. It's better than what we had. And it's like Agile has lost the plot, right? The plot was you sit the customer next to the developer, and then you write the stories that the customer wants, and the developer knows exactly what's happening. And I don't think that happens anymore. I'm not sure. I don't think it does. There's no room. So maybe that's the thing, right? Is boy, I'm just thinking this now. But I might be stuck. I might be stuck in the grand days of software development when you would put five guys in a room with three computers and they would fight about code until a masterpiece came out, right? Or yeah, 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 you know, or there's there's something to be said for cliches, and one of them is if you want something done right, do it yourself. Expanding on that cliche would be, if you don't want to get called at 2 in the morning, make sure your shit works, right? And that's where testing came from. It had, as far as writing unit tests and writing code that tests your code, and instrumenting your code for good logging. That's where that comes from, because you don't want any errors. That's why you want to test it, and before you even release it, you want to make sure that your individual methods, your individual pieces of code work the way they're expected to work, not only now but in the future. All that stuff was around before Agile, right? And when Agile started, there wasn't so much process, there wasn't so much layers, right? And now there's a lot of layers. Now Agile, from what I'm seeing, is just corporate Agile. It's just another cathedral, which falls into my first developer thoughts, right? So what breaks the cathedral? What brings back the innovation? What brings back the what's that lyric from the Rush song? The I'll never remember it. Something about fascination and the underlying dream, right? What's going to bring that back into software development if we're all telepresenced? You know, back in the day, yeah, there were guys in their basement, and there's a particular guy from AT&T that was kind of my hero, and they did wonderful things, right? They would rewrite C libraries in assembly for the fun of it, and they would make great advances in TCP/IP, but those days are kind of gone, right? I mean, team development is really where it's at. Whether it's the military, I mean, if you're going to send in four guys, you don't send in four guys that have been in different parts, that haven't been hanging out with each other in 3 months, right? I guess if you're going to write software developer, you're not gonna be. I'd like to hear. I'd like to hear real successful team software development with telecommuting. I'd like to hear a good story, I guess, and I'm sure they're out there. Plenty of people seem to be defending it, but man, 9 times out of 10, the first people who are defending working from home in IT, the first thing that they say to me is, "Oh, I can just roll right out of bed and get into my chair, and I'm at work." Or oh, it's so nice to, I can be able to just do things around the house, or I can watch things if something goes on. It's just like, holy cow, man! It's like the 9 to 5 is dead, but what it's going to be replaced with. And then I've talked to junior developers, young guys that are, talking about how they are doing Agile, and they're stuck in their small apartment or whatever it is that they're in, and they're not happy because it's just them. They're getting bored with doing this. It would be like I love video games, but I wouldn't play the same game 8 hours a day by myself, right? And that's what they say they work agile because they use a Kanban, right? Because they're supposed to be writing unit tests, but I don't think a lot of them are really doing that good of a job of writing unit tests. It's just not the same when you've got somebody sitting next to you who you like look at. You can't like side eye them all the time and get away with not testing shit, right? But wage slavery came up. The term wage slavery came up. Now, I used to use this term back in the 90s. Wage slave. I used to use this term before I became a software developer, right? And now I hear a kid tell me that he's a wage slave and that he's like he could be replaced at any time, because all he does is he just sits and stares at the same story till it's done, and then he pulls the next one. And there's not the gratification, I think. When you are sitting next to somebody and you get the story done, you kind of look at the guy and you're going to say, we're done. We're done. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what the future of software development is. I was one of my software development friends called me and said, "Hey, I'm using Chat GPT, and I'm using it to write scripts for trading." And I'm just like, are you doing any back testing? I think he's going to lose money on that. I told him he was going to lose money on that. I told him that wasn't a good idea, but he's going to tell me how he does. But I told him not to. I told him he better figure out exactly what kind of methodology Chat GPT is using for the script. But what happens when AI gets to the point where it's like it can just write the code from the story? Has some input of context, and boom, it's done. It'll be interesting to see. I don't think we're going to be there. I played with ChatGPT, and it is so frustrating. Oh my God. Not even happy with it. I get it. It does some neat things, but man, oh man, its input is flawed. It could use some work, in my opinion, but that's just me. I'm sure a lot of people out there are hitting it and loving it and thinking it's fantastic. It seems too canned to me, especially when you're trying to get it to back a point that you want it to back, I guess. I don't know. You're asking it, well, where are you getting this data from? Because I'm getting data from this website. And it's just like, well, blah, 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 blah. Same can. Change the topic. Same format of response. Same kind of mishmash of, I'm going to try and be correct no matter what. Because everything on the internet is so muddy, would be my guess. But yeah, the next year is going to be bad for white collar. It's going to be really bad for white collar guys. Because that's where so we had years and years of spending. When COVID came out, IT departments were hiring. They went to telecommuting and they were hiring. And when they saw their decrease in performance, they kept hiring to make up for that, with the assumption that if they didn't have to pay for office space, they were still coming out ahead somehow, but they didn't come out ahead. And we'll go back to Twitter. One of the things that I read was that they were very interested in code accountability with their software developers. So software developers that weren't accountable for working on certain projects and contributing to those certain projects, those are the guys that were let go. So if they got rid of 10% just by getting rid of the guys that weren't getting stuff done or weren't contributing nearly as much as their teammates, yeah, that's what happens. That's what you have to expect. 2008, a lot of things were unfair when a lot of developers were let go. It was a lot of things were unfair. Even I had a hard time understanding what the company was doing, but there's two kinds of companies. Hopefully, if you get let go, it's a company that needs to let you go because they actually won't financially make it through the next year if they don't. Other companies, they're going to let you go and their stock is going to go through the roof. And people that are left at that company are going to make money and the stockholders are going to make money. Everybody's going to be mad. That'll be our first, once we've seen a couple waves of layoffs, then we'll see the companies, their stock will go up. And that's the point, is to get the stock to go up, right? In a very downturn. And at this point, with a depression being a possibility on the table, right? A lot of companies, they're looking for any dead weight that they can find, right? They're looking for the box checkers. And that's like in 2000, that was what they were getting rid of. They were getting rid of a lot of box checkers in the workforce. A lot of box checking type jobs were a lot of middle management was on the table in 2000. Yeah, that was rough too. Okay, well, none of this is pleasant, but I figured I would get it knocked out and on here as a software developer's thought. So, yeah, boy, new year. I hope it's good. I really do. But, all right, peace.